Hello, my name's Ethan Wilcox, and I will be discussing work conducted with Jennifer Hu, John Gauthier, Peng Qian, and Roger Levy at the Computational Psycholinguistics Lab at MIT. Now, neural network language models are everywhere. They're deployed in a broad range of technology, and that word can mean slightly different things. So I'll be talking about them today as functions specifically that assign probabilities to strings. Say we have the string, for a long time I went to bed early, and you want to get the probability of the string, you can use the chain rule to decompose it into the probability of 4 times the probability of A given 4, so on and so on, until you get the probability of early given for a long time I went to bed. And what this does is this takes the problem of getting the full sentence probability and breaks it into the problem of getting the probability of an individual token given a context. And that's what these algorithms are. They're context-sensitive distributions over tokens or over words. For a neural network language model, this context is encoded in the neural state. And the question we're asking in this research is, can these neural network language models serve as a good basis for models of human language processing? What this boils down to is finding an important evaluation kind of metric or evaluation criteria. So the question is, how are we going to evaluate neural networks as models of linguistic cognition? Now, the traditional way that you evaluate a neural network model, language model, is through perplexity. Perplexity is the inverse geometric mean of the probability of a test corpus. So you have a test corpus W, which has size n. Now, perplexity is good, but there are a couple of problems with it. The first is that it's not directly comparable to human behavior. So humans don't necessarily give you a perplexity perplexity score when they're reading. Second is that it's hard to use perplexity to assess some signature aspects of human language use, such as few-shot learning, or kind of how knowledge that appears on the long tail of words. Lastly, perplexity is an average metric, so it doesn't target the critical test cases that may be so important for linguistic theory building. In order to kind of approach this big framing question, we'll be introducing two methods we've been developing in order to answer this question more directly. So the first is a psycholinguistic assessment of grammar, in which we ask how good is a language model at predicting when a sentence is ungrammatical. And the second is assessing a model's predictive power for human psychometrics. So for asking how good is a language model at predicting human online processing data. And I'll discuss this psycholinguistic assessment first. To give you a flavor of how the psycholinguistic assessment works, I'll discuss a famous example, which is subject-verb number agreement. So the first sentence here is ungrammatical insofar as it has a number agreement error. So the keys to the cabinet is on the table, the verb is doesn't match with the plural noun keys. So it has a little red X next to it. Whereas this sentence is grammatical, it gets a green check mark. If we want to understand whether or not the models are learning the subject-verb number agreement rule, we can feed both of these into a neural net language model. And if the model did learn this rule, it should assign a higher probability to the grammatical B sentence than to the ungrammatical A sentence. Now, this example is interesting because the distractor noun is linearly, we have a distractor noun in this sentence which kind of has the opposite number, and that's linearly closer to the verb. However, agreement it isn't based on linear distance, but rather on the hierarchical composition of the sentence. So in some ways, this test across distractors shows evidence, or can show evidence of sensitivity to this hierarchical structure. Now, in order to scale up these tests and test a broad range of phenomena, we report what's an accuracy score, so an average accuracy score across many items. We ask, what proportion of the time does the model prefer the grammatical condition? Now, we write a number of tests, like the one I just showed you in the last slide, across a broad range of syntactic phenomena, which we divide into individual circuits. Inside the circuits, the tests target similar things. So I'm just going to give a quick tour of the circuits that we test. The first is center embedding. So this assesses model ability to have a kind of first in, last out stack-like processing that would be required to process certain relative clauses. So, for example, the diamond that the thief glittered stole is an implausible phrase because thieves don't glitter and diamonds don't steal. We also test licensing. So the senator has ever lied is ungrammatical, but the no senator has ever lied is grammatical. We test a model sensitivity towards long-distance dependencies. So this is a filler gap dependency. I know who the mayor saw yesterday. There's a gap after the verb see, and it enters into a dependency with this WH word. But I know that the mayor saw yesterday is ungrammatical because there's no WH word that can enter into this gap after the verb saw. We assess models' gross ability to process gross syntactic state. So these tests in this circuit include sentences like, while the pianist practiced, the conductor stretched, which is grammatical, and then the pianist practiced, the conductor stretched, which doesn't have this subordinator and is ungrammatical. We assess model sensitivity towards garden path effects. So the player tossed, the frisbee tripped. This is not strictly ungrammatical, but tripped should be very kind of surprising, whereas the player thrown the frisbee tripped is kind of perfectly expected. And then we have number rudiment, like I showed you in the previous slide. Now, we kind of average these together. We combine them together into a score across these circuits, which we refer to as the syntactic generalization score, or SG score. Now, all the examples I've been showing you here are kind of a one-way contrast between two sentences, but in fact, we deploy a 2x2 success criteria following methods from psycholinguistics. And just to give you a flavor of what that looks like, I've given you one for agreement here. So we test both that the models know that the plural noun should be associated with the plural verb, and that the singular noun should be associated with the singular verb. All right, now what types of models do we test? We start off with a 5-gram and n-gram baseline, and that's not a neural network model per se. We test a variety of neural network models. We use a recurrent neural network with long short-term memory architecture. These models have been around for a number of years, and they have no obvious hierarchical bias. We test transformer models using the GPT-2 architecture. These models use self-attention, and they're oftentimes the state of the art in natural language processing. In addition, we test a structurally supervised model. So this is a recurrent neural network grammar, RNNG, and this is trained with a syntactic parse, and it actively predicts the syntactic structure of a sentence and uses this prediction to kind of guide its composition of word representations. All right, so these are the architecture types that we test. As in terms of training data, all of our training data comes from the BLLIP subsets of the BLLIP corpus. We have an extra small data set, which has 1 million tokens, a small data set that has 5 million tokens, a medium data set that has 14 million tokens, and a large data set that has 42 million tokens. So we get 16 kind of architecture times training data model types. We run multiple random seeds, and some of the models use byte pair coding, which is a subword tokenization scheme that's been trained on about 8 billion words. And the BPE, byte pair encoding models, will be outlined in orange on the graphs, so you'll be able to see which ones those are. In addition to these controlled models, where we control the training data size, we have a couple of large-scale pre-trained models. So we have a pre-trained transformer, also GPT-2 architecture, which is trained on 8 billion tokens. We have a pre-trained LSTM, one on 1 billion tokens and one on 90 million tokens. So we want to ask, what is the relationship between a model's perplexity? We've trained all these models. What is the relationship between their perplexity and their syntactic generalization score? So here are the results for this, with the test perplexity on the x-axis and the SG score on the y-axis. And there's a couple of important things to note. The first is that the best performing models are these transformers that are enhanced with a subword tokenization scheme. However, the controlled models, so here we have kind of our controlled models, they perform about as well at SG score as the large-scale models, that's these kind of dashed lines, which are trained on orders of magnitude more data. And lastly, we see that the models with limited context, so the n-gram models, barely perform above baseline. This is this bottom dashed line is a random baseline. Okay, so digging a little bit more into the contemporary neural net models, the controlled architectures, when we take away the BPE models and the n-gram models, this is what we see, and kind of crucially, there's no real relationship here between perplexity and syntactic generalization. Now we can dig into this a little bit more. In addition to looking at perplexity and syntactic generalization, we can ask the kind of relative importance of model architecture and training data size. So that's what we'll do here, and I'll just baseline each model's performance on every suite by the kind of across model and training data performance on that suite. And on the left, we separate performance by model type, and on the right, we separate performance by training data size. This is removing models with the byte parent coding because they can leverage information from kind of a much larger vocabulary in the subword tokenization scheme. But once we do that, we see that model inductive bias has a much larger effect on SG score than training data size does. And the RNNG, the supervised model, the syntactically supervised model, performs better than the others. All right, so takeaways from the controlled syntactic evaluation section. We provided a scaled-up evaluation of syntactic generalization on a broad range of phenomena. We see that overall there's a lack of relationship between test set perplexity and syntactic generalization score. And we see that model inductive bias has a larger effect than training data size. So, all right, moving on to the next section, we'll look at the predictive power for human psychometrics. And in this case, we'll ask, how good is a model at predicting human online processing data like gaze duration or self-paced reading? So we'll use real-time processing here as a window into linguistic cognition. Now our models give us probabilities, but humans give us reading times. The way that we're going to link these two is through surprisal. Surprisal is the negative log probability of a word given its context. And it's been shown in a paper about 7 years ago that there's a linear relationship between surprisal and reading time across a broad range of surprisal values. And this work was done using 3-gram models. So we want to, one thing we'll be looking at is whether or not this linear relationship kind of holds in the neural domain. Giving you a bit of digging into the history of the research or about model predictive power, there's been some mixed empirical results. So one paper found that models without hierarchical bias actually have better predictive power. One paper found that models with lower perplexity have more predictive power. And another paper found that there's this linear relationship between perplexity and predictive power. Okay. Now, we'll be using the same model times training data pairs as we did in the previous section, and we'll be getting reading times in order to assess the predictive power on 3 test corpora. So the first test corpus is the Dundee corpus, which is an eye-tracking corpus. The second one is the natural stories, and the third is the Brown corpus, and both of these are self-paced reading corpora. At the end of this, we have a data set of paired reading times and surprisal values, and that's what we'll use to do the next analyses. So first, we want to assess surprisal as a linking function by asking whether or not models capture real-time processing difficulty. This is a GAM regression fit showing the slowdown due to surprisal and the surprisal at each of the tokens. The gray boxes here show histograms of surprisal values, and I'm just showing you for kind of a subset of our models on the Dundee corpus, but you can see here that there's quite, as was found previously, there's quite a linear relationship between the surprisal and the reading time. Now, this isn't true just for the Dundee corpus and the models I'm showing you here. If we zoom out and take a look at all of the corpora that we tested across all of the training, or the testing, the testing corpora and the training data corpora and the models, we see that across all of these, there's a relatively linear relationship between the surprisal and the reading time. So we see that this type of relationship holds for these contemporary neural models, not just the n-gram models. All right, Now, these tell us that the models are generally good at capturing some aspects of reading time behavior, but it doesn't tell us which model is the best. So in order to do that, we'll be deriving the delta log likelihood. Now, this is a methodology from Goodkind and Bicknell, paper 2018, and in order to do this, you train two linear models to predict reading times from surprisals. The first linear model is a baseline model, and that includes only context-insensitive predictors. The second model is a language model-derived model, and that includes surprisal as a context-sensitive predictor. In order to get the delta log likelihood, or DLL, we get the mean difference in per token log likelihood across a 10-fold cross-validation train test split. Now, in this case, the higher delta log likelihood means that the surprisal values of the model have more predictive power. Okay, so now we can plot the delta log likelihood versus perplexity, and that's what we're doing on this graph here. The perplexity is on the x-axis, and the delta log likelihood is on the y-axis. There are kind of two crucial things to note. The first is that we do find, like in the Goodkind and Bicknell paper, a monotonic relationship between perplexity and delta log likelihood. And this is significant within the training data. We do a regression linear mixed effects models analysis to test this. Secondly, we find that the n-gram models actually overperform based on their perplexity. So here we see these circles are n-gram models. We see that they have quite high test set perplexity, but they also have quite high delta log likelihood per token, and they actually perform better in this metric than many of the neural models that are trained on the same training data size. Okay. Now, in the previous section, I discussed the syntactic generalization score. So what we can do here is we can actually take a look at the relationship between the delta log likelihood and the SG score. And in this case, when we relate the two, I'll residualize everything with respect to perplexity. So this tells us the SG score and the delta log likelihood effect that is not accounted for by the model's perplexity. On the x-axis, we see this residualized SG score, and on the y-axis, we see this residualized DLL, and importantly, we see no significant relationship between the delta log likelihood and the syntactic generalization score. So this tells us that the positive effect of quality syntactic representations may be washed out by this broad coverage reading time evaluation. All right, so the takeaways from this section are that we find a linear relationship between byword surprisal and reading times for these contemporary neural network models, and we find a monotonic relationship between perplexity and delta log likelihood. And these are kind of both confirming results that had been established for other model types. Moving into kind of more new contributions, we find an effect of inductive bias, but it's kind of in the opposite direction from syntactic generalization score. So in this case, the n-gram models are actually performing better than we would expect at predicting human reading times, especially in the Dundee corpus. And we also find that different modeling approaches may be needed for naturalistic reading versus the controlled syntactic tests. All right, so zooming out, we found that neural models can capture both syntactic generalization and expectations deployed in human naturalistic reading. We find that in both of these kind of testing paradigms, architecture can contribute more than training data size for human-like performance, or at least architecture can contribute very significantly for human-like performance. And then, interestingly, different architectures may be optimal for modeling different tasks. Lastly, if you're interested in the controlled syntactic evaluation, we have a website, syntaxgym.org, where you can go online and create your own test suites, and we will automatically run these neural network models on them and give you give you accuracy scores for your test suites. So please go online and check it out. It's a really, really cool website, and we would love community contributions, especially from this community. Yeah, we're very excited to share it with all of you. So thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.